the Middle Ages are separated into three different time periods, really. The first is the early Middle Ages, and that's noteworthy because we see many local leaders without much power. In 476 CE, the Roman Empire collapses. That's the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, based out of Byzantium / Constantinople / now Istanbul, lasts all the way up until 1215. But the Western Roman Empire falls apart, and the Roman Empire had taken care of everything. The phrase "all roads lead to Rome," the saying "all roads lead to Rome," is an example of how the Romans took care of the infrastructure of their entire empire. They rolled out standardized coinage, so no matter where you went in the empire, the amount of gold that you had was worth the same amount. They took care of things like plumbing and the aqueduct system in order to bring fresh water in and take dirty water away. All of that goes away. And so it leads to a really chaotic time period where we typically don't see leaders exacting a large amount of power. Charlemagne is going to be the biggest example against this in the 800s. But other than that, you start to see smaller regions begin to cling together. And these local kings are going to have some power, but they're not going to be the dominant monarchs that we're going to see later on as we move through the Renaissance. The High Middle Ages, this is your traditional Middle Age time period. Castles and knights and near constant battling. This is the time period where we see the Crusades take place. And this is also the time period where feudalism and the power of the Roman Catholic Church is at its peak. Basically, at this point, if you're any person living within Europe, your life revolves around two things: not dying and your religion. And so the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope specifically wield an immense amount of power during this time period. Finally, we have the Late Middle Ages. The Late Middle Ages, this is more of a transitional period. We're starting to move away from the Dark Ages and into the light of the Renaissance. This is where we see the rebirth of cultural learning. We're going to see people look back to the classics of ancient Greece and Rome to try to guide them and look back to them for information. And so this time period is where we're going to see some of those Ninja Turtle artists pop up. We're also going to see people begin to look at the individual, and that's going to be a key point later on today. In addition to the chaos shortly after the fall of the Roman Empire of not having a kind of centralized government, we also have a variety of barbaric tribes during this time period that really they're talking about non-Christian tribes moving into Europe and creating havoc. That includes the Muslims as the Islamic empires through the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Spain begin to grow in power. We have the Magyars from the Far East. As you can see, very, very skilled on horseback. This is going to be related to the Mongol empires as well. And then finally the Vikings, which really Vikings is a profession. We probably should refer to them as the Norse, but they're coming in, especially into Brittany, especially into into Saxony and Germany, especially into the more northern parts of continental Europe and the British Isles, creating havoc. Here we just have some representations of each of those barbaric tribes. And so we're presented with this need for feudalism. It's a need for safety, a need for protection. So we have these local kings who are able to consolidate some amount of power. It's not going to be a lot, and these really aren't large kingdoms. And the fact that there are so many of them actually leads to more chaos within Europe, because in addition to fighting off the barbaric tribes, you're also fighting off these other local kings who are trying to maybe increase their power or at least keep their power. So there's near constant fighting amongst the Christians within Europe as well. And that's part of the reason that the Crusades end up happening, is Pope Urban II realizes that there's a need to try to stop the kings from fighting each other across Europe in order to wield some more power from Christianity's point of view. But that leads to a need for feudalism, and feudalism is going to be this political system that allows people to organize for protection and for the benefit of all the members. And this slide is really going to show you what that looks like. So as you move down, you're going to have more members of each of those groups, and you're also going to have less power overall. So you have these local kings at the top. Down the left-hand side, they're going to give fiefs, or these tracts of land, to lords. And lords are really kind of the ones who run the day-to-day operations on that land. Then you have the knights, And the knights are provided with some shelter, some protection. They're probably going to get some land as well. Anyone who receives land in return for loyalty essentially is known as a vassal. So these lords and these knights are known as vassals. And then the serfs are provided with food, shelter, and protection, which again is what they're looking for. On the right-hand side, as we go up, you'll notice that the serfs, those are going to be your main food producers. They're going to farm the land. In some cases, they're going to be merchants of other things in a variety of ways. The knights are going to provide military service if asked, and the lords are, if they're asked by the king to provide people to fight, they're going to be able to do that. You notice the Pope over here, and I placed the Pope over off to the side. The Pope is not a part of the feudalism hierarchy, but the Pope is probably the most powerful person in Europe during this time. The popes have the ability to kind of force the king's hand a little bit. If the king runs afoul of the Pope, doesn't show loyalty to the Pope can excommunicate the king. You might say, all right, well, what's the big deal? You're kicked out of the church. But remember, these people's lives revolve around religion. It's not dying and religion, maybe in that order, or maybe even reversed. They are expected to provide absolute obedience to their religion. And so for these people, if their king is excommunicated, they are excommunicated as well. And so the Pope can kind of hang that over the king's heads to ensure that the kings are doing what he wants. And that brings us to the Black Death. So Black Death, really the Black Death is a collection of 3 different plagues that occur in the 1300s. We're going to see a very small window of time that we're going to be looking at to call the Black Death. But plagues in general, they kind of go through regular cycles within Europe. You know, every maybe 60 years, you're going to see plague pop up. But the big one, the heaviest one, is going to occur from 1347 to about 1350 or 1355. And it's really characterized by 3 different plagues that are spread. The bubonic plague is the most common. It's characterized by the signature lumps or buboes that occur on the lymph nodes, the neck, the armpit, the groin. The septicemic, which is going to affect the circulatory system, and the pneumonic plague, which is going to affect the lungs. This is where you get the coughing and hacking up of flecks of blood that becomes so prominent during this time period. The bottom line is, with all of these popping up, and people really didn't understand why they were happening, and that's going to be a key point as we move forward. Here are some pictures. Note the dates on the pictures. Plague still is around today. You can see the signature buboes that are there. Plague is still around today. Places with poor sanitation, poor access to drinking water, those kinds of things. But why we really see this is it's going to affect the entirety of Europe. As with most pandemics, they're going to begin in Asia. The Tartars then bring them over into the Black Sea region. And if you see here, here is Kaffa. This is a city on the Crimean Peninsula right here. This is the Black Sea, which you're looking at here. And the Black Sea has always been an important area for trade. And the way that the story goes is there's a fight on Kaffa between the Tartars and the Genoese. There's a decent-sized trading empire based out of Genoa. At this point in Italy, you have these separate kingdoms, and Genoa is one of the more powerful ones, specifically due to its ability to trade. So they're located here on the Black Sea, and there's a fight at Kaffa between a Genoese, a sailor from Genoa, and a Tartar. And that eventually kind of leads into all-out war. The Tartars then surround the Christian part of the city, the Genoese part of the city, and they basically lay siege to it. Well, the Italians are contained within this one small portion, and plague starts to strike the Tartars. And so the Tartars then lob some of the infected bodies over the walls of the city, hoping to share their misery with the Christian Genoese. The Genoese realize maybe this isn't worth it. They get back on their ships, travel out of Kaffa, and they take the Black Death with them. Traditionally, it's the rat that gets blamed for the spread of the disease because the rat carries the flea, and the flea carries the bacteria, Y. pestis or Yersinia pestis. But now, as been in the last 5 to 10 years, most medical professionals believe that the bacteria changed to the point where it could be communicated from person to person, and that's what leads to the large dispersal rates. Even with how trashy the medieval cities were, the odds of it just being passed by animals that are carrying the fleas is highly unlikely. So eventually we start to see the spread of germs. Obviously, germ theory is still a ways off, but that's what our most accurate belief is at this point in time. And so we see the spread. It's kind of like a reverse C. Starting over here, here's the Black Sea again, here's the Crimean Peninsula. Spreads kind of down south along the Mediterranean, along those trade routes, and then begins to extend up from there. And you notice it spreads extremely quickly. Look at the waves that are happening and look at the time frames that these are happening. There's really not much time that it takes to spread across these different areas. One of the more famous authors during this time period is Giovanni Boccaccio, and he writes a diary and keeps this diary. He's a contemporary of Petrarch, whom we'll get to in a few minutes here. And he's writing in Italian, the native language. He's not writing for scientific purposes. And so anyone can read this diary. He's the one who's famous for the line that plague victims would have lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors. The incubation period for some of these diseases, the time before you see any of the symptoms, could be anywhere from 3 to 7 days. So you might be sick with the plague and not even realize it. But this diary is pretty famous in terms of literature during this time period. Again, he's a contemporary of Petrarch and Dante Alighieri of Dante's Inferno fame. The Black Death has a major impact on society. It leads to an extreme loss of people. And we notice that the feudal structure, the feudal hierarchy, was dependent upon having a large amount of people, especially at the bottom parts of that hierarchy, in order to function properly. So as you lose those people, you lose the ability to provide food for everyone. That, in turn, is going to lead to a loss of the agricultural industrial complex because now people aren't going to be able to farm enough food to provide for everyone within that kingdom. And it's going to lead to a loss of skills. If your family was a family who learned how to tan hides, how to make leather, and everyone in your family died, then that skill for that particular area is going to go away. So we have this weird loss of knowledge during this time frame as well. It leads to a loss of will to work. If you think about it logically, if you are a serf and your boss tells you, yeah, you're going to need to come in on Saturday because we lost 25 people last week, the odds that you're going to be willing to do that as opposed to, say, just try to stay alive is going to be pretty significant. That leads to a supply and demand problem. So for those menial jobs, maybe even things like removing, burying, and burning of dead bodies, the people who are willing to do those jobs are going to be able to command more money. And so we're starting to see some of the ideas of a more capitalistic society come out. Obviously, we are nowhere near capitalism yet, kids, but this is leading us down the path of a changing of mindset. Not you deserve to get paid more because of your family name, but you deserve to get paid more because of the job you're willing to do. And then finally, art and literature are going to be affected. As I mentioned, Boccaccio, he's not going to write in Latin, he's going to write in Italian. And we'll see that pop up a few other times. It also changes the art. Here's a great example of Danse Macabre. The dancing skeletons that you see here are really indicative of this time period. And it's almost like a way of dealing with pain and loss. If you make light of the fact that death is all around you, it allows you to deal with it a little bit easier. The burden won't be so heavy on you. And finally, the church is going to be very negatively affected. Obviously, Christianity Roman Catholicism at this point is the only religion in Europe for the most part. You do have pockets of Jews and you have the Muslims moving in through Spain, but for the most part, if you're living in Europe, you are a Christian. Well, the church is going to tell people to pray, and that's how they're going to be saved. But for these people, they realize, people are praying and they're still dying. So it leads to some of a loss of confidence in the Catholic Church. And so that's going to affect how the church can be perceived as the ruler of all of Europe. We see this backlash happen because people are no longer going to have quite the same amount of faith in the church as they once did. We're going to pause there and I'll pick up with the second video.